Hey, Cliff Goldstein here. Welcome to the program. Maybe some of you have heard of the late Christopher Hitchens. He was one of the most well-known public intellectuals past number of years, especially in the United States and Europe. He had been born and educated in England. Hitchens moved to the United States, I believe in the D.C. area, where he lived with his family. Hitch, as he has been nicknamed, was a great speaker. Just listen to him on YouTube. I mean, I'd kill to have a voice like that. Anything better than this New York twang. I think I sound like Woody Allen on steroids or something. Ugh. But anyway, beautiful voice. And he was an excellent writer, too. I can remember, it could have been 20, 25 years ago. I was sitting somewhere, and I'm reading some gaudy magazine in an airport or something, and I'm reading this excellent article. And I'm thinking, man, this is really good quality for a rag like this. So just out of curiosity, I flipped back, and sure enough, the article had been written by Christopher Hitchens. And did he have a strong pen? Woo! I mean, no one was spared this guy's invective, particularly when he was angry, especially the royal family. Oh, he once called Prince Charles, quote, a morose, bad-eared, and chinless man, prematurely aged, with the most abysmal taste in royal consorts. He had called Princess Diana, when she was alive, an airhead and a gold digger. And I can't imagine what if Hitchens were alive today, what he'd say about the hapless Prince Andrew, or about the spoiled brat Prince Harry and his wife fleeing Britain and going into voluntary exile here in the rebellious American colonies. And if you crossed him, watch out. I mean, this guy actually wrote a book. I'm not even going to give you the title of the book because I'd get in trouble. But he wrote a book attacking, believe it or not, Mother Teresa. Okay? I mean, nothing was sacrosanct with this guy. Now, over the years, I have consumed his work. Even when I disagreed with him, I still enjoyed reading him, okay? And, I did think, for instance, his Trotskyite phase was rather puerile. But, well, we all live and learn, ideally. Now, those of us old enough to remember 9/11 can remember how traumatizing it was for us, particularly here in America. I can remember I had a friend, I know a girl I met, didn't know, she used to go to she used to come to the area where I lived in the summer, and I probably saw her, we were kids, but I didn't know her till later, that she lost her sister in the second tower. And I can remember 8:30 in the morning on September 11th, a friend of mine where I worked, stood in the door of my office, a colonel, and he said to me, 8:30 in the morning on September 11th, he goes, I will take you and your son on a tour of the Pentagon. Woo, that was pretty creepy. And I can remember the next day he came to my office, he stood in the door and said, we're going to have to cancel that for now. No kidding. Now, Christopher Hitchens had a very strong reaction to 9/11. And, I really think it was more an emotional reaction than a logical one. It's really not that surprising because Aristotle once said man is a rational animal. And that's true. but man is also an emotional animal. In fact, I think we're a lot more emotional than rational. I think it was David Hume who said that we use our rationality to justify satisfying the emotional or physical side of us. Anyway, after 9/11, apparently unable to differentiate between Islamic fanatics who fly planes into buildings and say Quakers who run homeless shelters or Seventh-day Adventists with relief projects all over the world, Hitchens went on a rampage against all faith, all religions, against even the idea of God's existence. He, along with his fellow traveler new atheists, began kind of an intellectual jihad against theism, all theism, regardless of who the theos was, and to them, according to them, never existed anyway. Now, his most famous tirade was a book called God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything. Okay, I mean, it came out in 2007, and it really was not, it was so bad I couldn't finish it. Not because I was threatened by the arguments, because the arguments were really just not that good. I just couldn't finish it because it was just so bad. I mean, but some of the arguments were, oh, come on. Things like Catholic priests molest little boys, ergo God does not exist. Or the argument, people do bad things in the name of faith, ergo faith is wrong. In it, he had such gems as this. Okay, just try to follow through his thinking here. If you got to read it carefully, it's clearer than it sounds. There still remains 4 irreducible objections to religious faith: that it wholly represents the origins of man and the cosmos, that because of this original error, it manages to combine the maximum of servility with the maximum of solipsism, that it is both the result and cause of dangerous sexual repression, and that it is ultimately grounded on wish thinking. Now, I'm not going to get into that now because none of this is true, or at least the part I understand, though I'm not sure what he meant by that because of this original error, it manages to combine the maximum of servility with the maximum of solipsism, whatever that meant. Anyway, he also wrote, listen to this: in Belfast, I have seen whole streets burned out by sectarian warfare between different sects of Christianity, and have interviewed people whose relatives have been killed or kidnapped or killed or tortured by rival religious death squads, often for no other reason than membership of another confession. And one more, or almost one more. To be more precise, the theocratic head of a foreign state, the Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, publicly offered money in his own name to suborn the murder of a novelist who was a citizen of another country. Those who were encouraged to carry out this bribed assassination scheme, which extended, quote, to all those involved in the publication of the satanic verses, were offered not just the cold cash, but also a free ticket to paradise. And then, too, this utterly vacuous argument, which shows, I'm afraid to say, a complete misunderstanding or lack of understanding of theology and the philosophical issues behind God. It's hard for me to believe he could say something so stupid as, quote, thus, the postulate of a designer or creator only raises the unanswerable question of who designed the designer or created the creator. I mean, come on. He really had nothing new to add in this book, but simply took most of the same old arguments against faith in God and so forth and used them. And used them, in my opinion, and he didn't do a particularly good job as well. I mean, I have read some very well done and thought out atheist apologetics, books much better than what Hitchens did here. In fact, I have read some very well done and very well thought out atheist apologetics, books that were much better than what Hitchens did here. In fact, I think even now, if I wanted to write some atheist tome against the existence of God, I think I probably could have done a better job than what he did in his book, God is Not Great. But anyway, the point is, the validity or the lack thereof regarding his arguments is not my point here. Instead, I want to read you something else that Hitchens had written in another work. And he was dealing with the question, and a valid one, I think, about how someone as he does, who does not believe in God, who does not believe in an afterlife, does not believe in a judgment or and so forth, how do people like this find meaning in life? It's the old question of what's it all about and what can it all mean if we're all doomed anyway? I thought this paragraph from a book by a woman named Elizabeth Wurtzel in her book Prozac Nation kind of captured the sentiment. Let me read this. I explain the same thing to everybody. It all seems pointless in light of the fact that we're all going to eventually die. Why do anything? Why wash my hair? Why read Moby Dick? Why fall in love? Why sit through 6 hours of Nicholas Nickleby? Why care about the American intervention in Central America? Why spend time trying to get into the right schools? Why dance to music when all of us are just slouching towards the same inevitable conclusion? The shortness of life, I keep saying, makes everything seem pointless when I think about the longness of death. When I look ahead, all I could see is my final demise. Well, fair enough. Okay. Anyway, Hitchens was dealing with this question about the meaning and purpose of life. What's it all about? And what's it all about, especially in a godless, purposeless, purely materialistic cosmos that Christopher Hitchens believed we existed in? And let me read you what he wrote. He said, "There are the beauties of science and the extraordinary marvels of nature. There is the consolation and irony of philosophy. There are the infinite splendors of literature and poetry. There is the grand resource of art and music and architecture. Again, not to exclude those that aspire to the sublime. In all these pursuits, any one of them enough to absorb a lifetime, there may be found a sense of awe and magnificence that does not depend at all on any invocation of the supernatural." Close quote. Now, I'm not going to argue, or who's going to argue about the extraordinary wonders of nature? Are you kidding me? It's mind-boggling. Not just the richness, the variety, the complexity, but the stunning beauty of it as well. I mean, for me, sometimes looking at some of the Apple, I look at some of the Apple wallpaper that comes on the operating system, from the drops of water drops on blades of grass to magnificent shots of a galaxy. There truly are extraordinary wonders. It's moving and it's amazing. Now, we talked about the consolation and irony of philosophy. Consolation of philosophy? Perhaps he was echoing Boethius's famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, which he wrote from a 6th century dungeon as he was awaiting his death sentence on some charge. And either sources say Boethius had his head chopped off, or he was beaten to death, or I even read somewhere they squeezed his skull so tight till his eyes bulged out. Well, anyway, the bottom line is I found the title of his work a little interesting, The Consolation of Philosophy, because I read his book, and as far as I could tell, there wasn't a whole lot of much consoling going on in there. And, fact is, I love philosophy. I read philosophy. But finding consolation in philosophy, whew, it's almost like going to a bar to look for teetotalers or something. Oh, I'm feeling a little down today, so let me read some Arthur Schopenhauer, or maybe I'll read some Albert Camus to brighten my day. I mean, nothing like a few chapters of Camus' La Peste or L'Étranger to lift the spirits, huh? How about this uplifting little mood enhancer from Camus? There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether or not life is worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Anyway, I could go on. There are a number of different, very depressing things from philosophers. Anyway, be that as it may, Christopher Hitchens. And for Christopher Hitchens, one could find meaning of life from the artistic and aesthetic pleasures and so on. And sure, I love art, I love music, I love poetry, I love all those things. But whether they can provide the meaning of life, well, that's another matter. And that's one that, though, really does matter. But anyway, what happened? Unfortunately, in 2010, Christopher Hitchens was diagnosed with cancer, esophageal cancer. That's tough stuff, esophageal cancer. It doesn't usually have a happy ending. Now, Hitchens wrote about this experience, and his words were compiled posthumously. He died in 2011 in a work called Mortality. Okay? And Hitchens wrote about getting sick, and the experience he had. It's kind of creepy because he writes like a diary, describing what happened until the end, which are just some unfinished fragments of a man dying in a hospital bed. But before that, he told about how he got sick. He says he was on tour, new book came out, and he knew something was drastically wrong. This is what he wrote. I have more than once in my time woken up feeling like death. He was quite a heavy drinker, okay? But nothing prepared me for the early morning in June when I came to consciousness feeling as if I were shackled to my own corpse. The whole cave of my chest and thorax seemed to have been hollowed out and then refilled with slow drying cement. I could faintly hear myself breathe, but could not manage to inflate my lungs. Whew. He then told about hearing the C word, and he went on. This alien had colonized a bit of my lungs, as well as quite a bit of my lymph nodes. And its original base of operations had been located for quite some time in my esophagus. My father had died, and very swiftly too, of cancer of the esophagus. he was 79. I am 61. In whatever kind of race life may be, I have very abruptly become a finalist. And he wrote this too. Nobody wants to be told about the countless minor horrors and humiliations that have become facts of life when your body turns from being a friend into being a foe. The boring switch from chronic constipation to its sudden dramatic opposite. The equally nasty double cross of feeling acute hunger while fearing even the scent of food. The absolute misery of gut-wrenching nausea on an utterly empty stomach. Or the pathetic discovery that hair loss extends to the disappearance of the follicles in your nostrils, and thus to the irritating phenomena of a permanently runny nose. And this, lost 14 pounds without trying, thin at last, but don't feel lighter because walking to the fridge is like a forced march. Then again, the vicious psoriasis, eczema pustules that no doctor could treat have gone too. This must be some impressive toxin I'm taking. And mercy for sleep purposes, but all the sleep aids and blissful doses seem somehow a waste of life. There's plenty of time in which to be unconscious. Woo. This is heavy stuff. And we find some of Christopher Hitchens' great wit as well, such as the lines, "But I do not walk around sporting a huge lapel button that reads, 'Ask me about my stage 4 metastasized esophageal cancer,' and only about that," and so forth. Now, there's a reason I'm quoting these things. And there was so much more. And what's important here, it's not so much what poor Christopher Hitchens wrote about, but it's what he didn't write about. Okay? As I said, he talked about how much he hurt, about the needles in his arms, and about how bad the drugs made him feel. But nothing, not a word, about the consolation and irony of philosophy somehow giving him hope or comfort to the meaning of his life and death. There was nothing about drawing hope and comfort from the awe and magnificence of art, literature, poetry, or music. Nothing, nada. In this book, you will not read one line from Christopher Hitchens about, again, hope and comfort from these things that he talked about so passionately before. Now, I say this with all possible sympathy for someone dying from a wretched disease. Where was all his talk about the wonders of nature and art and music? Suddenly facing death, he wasn't talking about deriving much meaning of his life or his death from these things. Of course not. Art is for the living, not the dying. The Eroica Symphony, wonderful stuff. But when cancer of the throat is slowly crushing the life out of you, and the little bit you've got left, chemotherapy is taken, Beethoven just doesn't seem to be what you really need, is it? It wasn't what he needed. Beethoven didn't solve the immediate problem before him, does it? And however great he reads Shakespeare's Hamlet, what good is it going to do for the dying? the fairy queen, or the scream might be great when you're alive. But when you're dying, who needs Edmund Spencer or Edward Munch? You need Jesus and the promise of eternal life. Whether Hitchens ever understood that, I don't know. There is some evidence that in private, Hitchens was not as hostile and was not as radically hostile to religion as his public persona was. I read a book about a guy, a Christian who knew Hitchens and even took him around to some of his meetings. And he had said he even gave Christopher Hitchens a Bible study in the book of John. And he said at one point, all John's talk about eternal life, he said, at one point Hitchens had said, wow, something like that could be pretty comforting for somebody dying. Okay? But in the end, there was no evidence. There was no evidence that Hitchens ever accepted Jesus. The guy called the book The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, and I just thought that was a little crass. I think that was a little too much. The fact that Hitchens might have been a little more open than he appeared publicly, I don't have a problem with that. But again, when I read his book, Mortality, and it wasn't so much what he wrote, it's what he didn't write. And in him talking about he talked about his pain and the sickness and the disease and what the chemicals were doing to him. But he didn't talk about finding meaning from art or literature or anything like that, because they are meaningless for the dying and even more meaningless for the dead. What's the only hope? Well, you've got it in the Word. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that who believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life.